To have the erosion, we can go to the physics catalog, and in here we have 3 simulation. The erosion 2, which is the old version of erosion, and we have the particle erosion, which is the newest version, and we have the hydro simulation, which will simulate the water and snow on the landscape. But we'll get to this later. For now, let's just put in a particle erosion node. Now, by default, this node is not going to do anything because the activated viewport option is turned off. So this node will not run in the viewport. It will only run when you hit F12 to render or you render the animation. However, I don't recommend doing that. So let's delete the viewer and create a bake node and connect the particle erosion to the bake, and then turn on the activated viewport and then click bake. The particle erosion node is very slow. So for a landscape resolution of 512, it's gonna take my computer around 30 seconds to run using all the default settings. So we have to wait 30 seconds. Alright, it's done, and let's turn on the timing. So this particular node took 27.9 seconds. So it's 28 seconds. And let's connect this to the output. And as you can see, the erosion is a little too strong, and it completely destroyed all the details. So here we have all these layering and all that, and the erosion kind of completely destroyed all of those. So we need to change the parameters of this particle erosion node to have a more desirable erosion. Let's take a closer look at the particle erosion node. We have 4 sections: the general settings, the big particle settings, the small particle settings, and the extra parameters. For now, the extra parameters only have like 1 parameter, which is the height channel, and by default it's the height channel. So let's have a look at the general settings first. We have the max particle size, and by setting this value to 0, World Blender will calculate the optimal maximum particle size for you. But you can manually set a maximum particle size for the landscape. For example, let's say 10 meters. And let's bake once more and wait for another 28 seconds. And there we go. You see, we now got rid of all the bigger cuts and we are left with the smaller cuts only. However, the erosion is still a little bit too strong, and we need to configure this a little further. Next, we have the max dirt erosion as well as the max rock erosion. By setting these values to 0, we have no limit whatsoever. However, if you set to, let's say, 1 for the the max rock erosion, then each particle will erode a maximum of 1 meter of rock at a time. So let's see the effects. So you see the big particles are now a lot weaker, while the small particles are still somewhat the same, because with this option set to 1, no matter how big or small a particle is, the maximum amount of rock it can erode at a time is 1 meter. So anyway, let me just set this back to 0 to have no limit whatsoever. And I will go back here and change the resolution to 256 so that we don't have to wait too much. Next, we have the dirt expansion. So every time a particle erode a bit of rock, it's going to turn that piece of rock into dirt. And you can set this expansion to increase or decrease the amount of dirt coming out of that particular amount of rock. Let's set to 2. That means you double the amount of dirt. And try again. And you see we have a lot more dirt now. So anyway, let me just set this back to 1 and see the difference. So you see we have less dirt coming from the mountain. Next, let's have a look at the passes parameter. By default, it's set to 0, which means World Blender will try to decide the optimal number of passes depending on the resolution of your landscape. So let's just set this to 0 to have auto passes. Basically, the erosion will run multiple times using different particle size. The first pass will run using the biggest particle size set by this parameter. And then we have the next pass, which will use a slightly smaller particles, and then another pass for smaller particles. And then we have the final pass that will use the smallest particles. So the smallest particles will have the size of 1 square. The passes will blend between the maximum and the minimum particle size to create the intermediate particles. So I can override this to, let's say, 3 passes. So we will have 1 pass for the biggest particles, and then another pass for the intermediate particles, and then the final pass for the smallest particles. And if you set the number of passes to 1, then World Blender will always use the smallest particle, and the max size for particles will no longer have any effects. So anyway, let me just set this back to 0. Next, we have the seed, which will randomize the population of particles. So let's set this to 3 and bake once more. So you see, we still have somewhat the same erosion, but the positions of the cracks, the cuts, are now different. Next, we have the big particle and small particle settings. The big particle settings will set the parameters for the biggest particles, and the small particle settings will set the parameters for the smallest particles, and the intermediate particles will blend between these values. Okay, so let's have a look at the big particle settings. We have the dirt erosion and the rock erosion parameter. These are the power of the particle. These numbers should be in between 0 and 1. So let's just reduce the rock erosion to 0.3 and leave the dirt erosion as 1 and bake once more. There we go. So we have less erosion and less dirt, and we now retain some of the layering before the erosion. This is before the erosion. This is after. Again, this is before and this is after. So you see, we still have the layers and the erosion is not as strong as before. Next, we have the density for the particles. Increasing this number by 2 times will increase the number of particles by 4 times. And it will also increase the computing time. So let's set this to 4 and see how long it will take. So it took 3.7 seconds for a 256 resolution landscape. The landscape looks a lot smoother because we have more particles that will cover more parts of the landscape. And let's set this back to 1 and back once more. And it took 3 seconds. So having more particles will increase the time a little bit. Next, we have the time. So basically, each pass will run this number of times. If we set this to 3, then each pass will run 3 times, which will also result in more erosion and more time consumption. So let's set this to 3 for now and see. All right, it's taking a lot longer and we have a lot more erosion. Let's set this back to 1 and set this rock erosion back to 1. Now, I don't recommend setting these two to be something higher than 1. However, if you set the power to be something higher than 1, let's say 3, then internally it's going to increase the time and then divide this value by the number of times to have this number always within 0 to 1. So let's say I set this to 2.5, then it will increase the time to 3 and then divide 2.5 by 3 to get the actual erosion power. Next, we have the iteration value. This is the maximum number of steps a particle can move across the landscape. So after a particle is populated on the landscape, it's going to move down the slope step by step, and the maximum number of steps it can move is 256. Next, we have the rest iteration, which is similar to the iteration, but after eroding the landscape, World Blender will populate another set of particles, but this time these particles will only erode the dirt, and it's going to carry the dirt down the slope and not erode the rock anymore. So again, it's going to move down using this number of steps. Okay, so that's the big particle settings. We have similar settings for the small particles, and then for the intermediate particles, they're going to blend these values depending on how big they are.